All right, my friends, here we go. Kinesiology 223, Chapter 12. Still talking psychological skills training, commonly known as PST. And this is presentation number 7. We're talking about program development, and this starts roughly on page 287. I figure I'd give you a little page number there to get an understanding where we are in the book. And then also, when you look at the key aspects of PST, you're looking at communication, assessing mental skills, and feedback. So let's jump into this. So this is a pretty decent sized list, and we're going to get to a couple of these and a couple of these here and then 3 other ones later on. And I broke this out and I did this kind of grayscale just so we can keep track of where we are because there's a lot of information coming at you in this presentation. And we'll talk about discussing approach and assessing athlete mental skills. But the book lays out 5 main aspects of this in terms of implementation, and it should not be viewed as mutually exclusive, but integrated into one another as a process. So discussing approach, assessing the mental skills, determining which skills to include, design a schedule, evaluate a program. They're all kind of interconnected. They all kind of dovetail together. Um, Communication, implementation, and evaluation are absolutely part of this process. You can't just like drop an intervention into your team environment and then not evaluate how it turned out. If you're going to allocate the time and the energy to learn about it on the front end and then implement it in the current moment, you need to evaluate its efficacy going forward. Otherwise, you need to course correct. So with approach, you need to discuss this, and really have the ability to articulate this and have good communication with your athletes and discuss, okay, here's what I'm doing. I'm going to go ahead and start implementing this in our off season and be able to implement this in the off season with the understanding that it'll increase our mental robustness and our mental toughness, and then be able to help you guys when we get into practice environment and game environment and we go into our season. So, you're informing them regarding the intentions, the implementation, and also the desired outcome to help set a positive tone for basically what is psychological skills training that starts in the off season. And that starts even with the communication. I'm kind of fumbling a little bit over my words there because, you think of it in terms of psychological skills training, just even the articulation of your intention is the start of psychological skills training, and you're starting a process and you're kind of opening the mind of your athlete to be able to be more receptive to when you have these coaching cues on the court, on the field of play, in the weight room, to be able to have these coaching cues that are delivered, but also received by the athlete, getting back to our communication chapter. And you've just set that expectation by informing them on the front end. So really the PST part starts the moment you start to explain to your athletes and set expectation that you're intending to do this is program wide. And there's another component here that has to be addressed, because it always comes down to the trust that you have in that athlete coach environment and the athlete trusting that, one, you know what the heck you're doing it for their best interest, and it is going to be a benefit to them going forward. So there's kind of 3 main parts here, and a little bit of selfishness on the athlete side because, they want to believe you're doing best for them, but, you have to operate from that mindset. So as a coach, you have to articulate those things very clearly. Here's what the heck we're doing. Here's when it's going to start. Here's how we're doing it. And then, quite frankly, here are the outcomes I'm looking for when we get into the season. That sets the tone and it allows your athletes to be more open to receiving that information. And it's that quality conversation that you have with your athletes. It's the trust, honesty, and communication that I always hammer home in these presentations, to be able to have that in place to say, here's what we're doing and here's why we're doing it. And you look at the effectiveness, there's a correlation between the relationship you have with your athletes and the efficacy of this type of program. And I would say you probably want to, if you're coming into a situation where it's a fixer-upper, you might want to work on the trust, honesty, and communication component first, and then you start to introduce in the psychological skills training, because otherwise you just come in right away and you're looking at doing psychological skills training before they even know who you are or what you're trying to accomplish. You might have to win your athletes over first. You need to assess their mental skills. Now, we talked about how different people are different athletes are different. They'll have different strengths and different weaknesses or different areas of opportunity, depending how you want to frame that up. And, you have to look at this in terms of how you can implement in the different psychological factors, I'm sorry, the different psychological skills training with your athletes and the different components, because just like your athletes will have different strengths and different weaknesses, you'll have different, if you will, capabilities within your athletes to understand and process, say, like psychological factors that can influence performance. And therefore, your athletes will have varying degrees of their ability to process and understand, but also utilize interventions in the context of sports performance. So with this, I highlight this, and you look at like one of the things you can do is you can have an oral interview, meaning you can sit down with your athletes and talk with them, and also do a written psychological inventory as a tool with your athletes. And there's a fine line there where if you start implementing in all these different types of different, whatever psychological inventories you'd like to use, and you're evaluating your people from disc profiles to a Wonderlic, I mean, you end up spending all your time with your athletes taking quizzes and tests to determine what makes them tick. At some point, what you need to do as a coach is just listen to them and have a conversation with them to understand what makes them tick. But there will be some benefit to using some of these inventories to be able to have like nice objective information. But in general, for most of us, if you're teaching in a middle school and you're coaching, eighth grade soccer, that's probably not a thing, right? But when you get into like higher level athletics, that will be something you'll look into. And they list a couple different testing instruments here. And, again, you can go ahead and look at a few of these and look at some of these different instruments over here. They also talk about, just in terms of the conversation, some interview questions. Tell me about your involvement in your sport, summarizing what you consider. These are things, if you're a coach, you'll know these, and you'll know some of these things when you're talking with your athletes. And I would urge you to say, like when you talk to them about their best or worst performances, don't guide them, don't bias the conversation, let them process and articulate to you what they thought was good or bad. Because remember, the perception of the athlete in the moment will be different than the perception of the coach viewing the athlete. So I would let them talk. And I've had these sit downs, with my coach in college, my defensive back coach. We would sit down and talk after the season, and even during the season, we would have some candid conversations on the field. And he was great in that regard, Coach Bukowski. He was wonderful in terms of, just being able to deliver poignant and very on point, if I can say it, coaching points in the moment, but also be able to, aside, perhaps outside the practice environment, say, and recall different things and let you talk through like what you thought was good or bad. So it's not as though he would guide or navigate the conversation. He would let you talk as an athlete. And no judges, right? No judgments on it either, which was wonderful. And then this side, here are some of the different tests that they suggest that you can use. I would say go ahead, maybe go out and look at a few of these if you're interested. But again, this might not be appropriate for what you're coaching. If you're coaching middle school soccer, it's just not a thing. But over here, talking with your athletes, listening to what they have to say, having a conversation with your athletes, this is probably more in your sweet spot than over here. Now, post-interview feedback, when you talk with your athletes, part of the communication process is the feedback. And, you have to have that feedback with your athletes. And I agree with this. I don't think you need to bury them in data points when you're coaching athletes or even working with clients in a fitness environment and you're trying to coach and cue people. The general rule of thumb is like our brains can only handle 3 things at once. You can only have 3 cueing points that are delivered to you. You can't give like 8 different things to change at once, because usually one begets another, begets another, begets another anyways. But you have to understand that you don't have to bury your athletes in data points. You can just kind of take an overview or just synthesize the information and provide, okay, you seem to be like high D, high I on a disc. You're definitely a high achiever and a leader. Let's go ahead and find a way to maybe get you more involved in that role. And it might be an apprehensive leader, or they might be somebody who's eager to be a leader, but they just not had the opportunity yet. So you can find ways to integrate those in and have a conversation with them. What you're looking for is trying to find the best, if you will, psychological skills that an athlete can use for their personality type or perhaps situation. You give them the ability to have maybe a catalog of different things they can use to have interventions or self-interventions. And you might even have a case where your athlete becomes savvy enough where they can recognize another player is in crisis, like we talked about, and they might be able to have an intervention on the field when their linebacker is freaking out over a missed holding call. And you'll have your leader on the field, who might be one of the other linebackers, just talk them off the ledge and say, hey, now that play's over, regroup, time to do this. Let's go ahead and take a moment and recenter ourselves and move on from there. And it just becomes a conversation that you can have with your athletes in the game environment, athlete to athlete, but also coach to athlete. But the big thing is, your athletes just need to have a better understanding of their self and their own best of fit self-interventions. I like how the book notes the difference between open and closed skills here, and they talk about how you have a sport that is very open, like running around with a team playing soccer, versus maybe you're on a green putting as a golfer. Those are different stressors and the environment's different. And as a coach, you have a coaching mindset where you coach your athletes in a game environment and there's 11 people on the field for football. That's going to be different than if you're coaching just one golfer and you talk with him before he goes up for his tee shot, right? So in terms of environmental, it depends on the sport as well. And sometimes in the closed sport environments, you have a higher stress because everybody's watching that one athlete, not like on a football field where you have 11 people on the field all running around. So the thinking and intervention process will be different for each one of these. But what I think about with this, and my mind kind of goes to this, is when you look at a sport like basketball, you have this very open environment when athletes are running up and down, they're in transition, they're going from offense to defense, et cetera, and all of a sudden there's a foul and they go to the line. It becomes a very closed environment, right? So it goes from very dynamic, where you have 10 people running around on the court, to where you have one person on the line and everybody's watching that one person take the shot. So it's very interesting how, like in a sport like basketball, it goes from open to closed very regularly. It's not like a penalty shot in soccer where there's maybe a couple of them a game. You have many free throws that happen in a game. Just a sidebar that kind of struck me there. So with that, guys, I'm going to go ahead and sign off of this one and move on to the next one. See you.